All right, hi everyone. I'm Carissa. I'm an assistant scientist with CIMAS and an affiliate at the Southeast Fisheries Science Center across the street. So today I'm going to be talking about our work integrating socioeconomic realities into fisheries stock assessments. So for those who aren't aware, stock assessments are really the backbone of fisheries management in the US. They are mathematical models that tell us a little bit about population size of our important fisheries and give us estimates as to how many fish we can sustainably harvest. And that information is used by fisheries managers to make decisions. And the underlying models are actually quite simple. So at their core, stock assessments try to estimate a biomass of fish species in the future, and it's based on how many fish we have now, current biomass, plus recruitment of new individuals into the population, plus growth of individuals, minus mortality due to natural causes, and minus fishing mortality. So it's a very basic equation. And there's a lot of complexity that can be added to each of these individual boxes, but historically stock assessments have sort of considered this equation in a vacuum. And we know that fisheries are complex socio-ecological systems, which means they can be influenced by a variety of external factors. A lot of things in the greater ecosystem can influence that assessment model equation. So for example, ecosystem drivers, hurricanes, changes in predator or prey landscapes, episodic events like red tides. These can all have an impact on our important fisheries. And there are also socioeconomic drivers, changes in things like gas prices, technology, pandemics. These can all influence fishermen's individual behavior. There's also feedback loops inherent to these complex systems. So actions have reactions that, if not explicitly accounted for, can undermine effective management. So we understand this, and this here is a snippet from NOAA's Stock Assessment Improvement Plan. And one of the major recommendations is there be more and routine consideration of ecosystem, environmental, and socioeconomic drivers in the assessment process. But unfortunately, this has been really challenging to implement in practice. It's really difficult to know which of these external variables are important and how to actually include them in a stock assessment context. And we're really missing sort of standardized methods and ways to do this. So that was sort of the purpose of our research. We wanted to try to develop a standardized methodology for incorporating these types of socioeconomic and ecosystem information into the stock assessment process. And we can sort of break down the assessment process into the 6 steps on the side here. So the models themselves are sort of central, but the broader process sort of starts with the initial data collection and ends here with communication of results to managers and stakeholders. And we felt that this sort of information could be contributed to each of these 6 steps. We also wanted to try to better understand the feedback loops and unintended consequences that are relevant to managing our important fisheries. So how did we do this? We took advantage of stakeholder knowledge. So stakeholders are local fishermen, fish dealers, sort of anybody with many years of experience using a particular fishery resource. And a lot of research has shown that fishermen have a wealth of knowledge about the environment. They are on the water often almost 24/7, and they're observing the ecosystems in which they live and thrive. So they have a lot of information they can share with us. And this type of information is generally called local, fisher, or traditional ecological knowledge. So we can take advantage of that knowledge, and we can sort of translate it into something that we can use in science and research through a process called participatory modeling. So this method, it helps us to increase understanding of really complex systems. And it's pretty simple. So via conversations and workshops with stakeholders, we create these conceptual models of a particular system. So all of these sticky notes here on the board here are the important attributes of a particular system as identified by fishermen. And all of the lines drawn between them are the important linkages. So what's driving what and influencing what. And it just provides a really nice visual representation of sort of everything that fishermen perceive are influencing that system. And so we used these methods and applied them to the red snapper in the Gulf of America. Red snapper, for those who aren't aware, is probably the most economically important species in the Gulf, targeted by both recreational and commercial fishermen. And it is currently undergoing a pretty substantial rebuilding plan after some significant overfishing in the late 80s and 90s. So it's a really complex fishery, a lot of things going on, and it's really important that we understand the various dynamics that could influence it. So I'll skip right over the methods here for the sake of time and just show you this model that you can't read at all, but that's fine. Suffice to say, all of these little circles are the nodes or the drivers in the system that fishermen identified. So this was based on interviews with 53 commercial, recreational, and charter fishermen throughout the Gulf. And all of the lines here, drawn between them are either positive or negative connections. And we just color-coded them here by things that are sort of system drivers, ecosystem services, and responses by humans. So it's a nice visualization. But now the question is, okay, we have this beautiful model. What do we do with it? So their next step here was to, again, break down the stock assessment process into these 6 steps. And then we identified the benefit of participatory modeling to each of those steps. And then using the red snapper model as a case study, we identified or came up with a specific methodology for incorporating that information into each of the steps. I don't have time to go through every single one today, but I'll give you a couple of examples. So the data processing step. So once you have data in hand, it has to be processed and formatted in a way that it can be input into a stock assessment model. And one of the things that we need to calculate is discard mortality. So discard mortality is basically when fishermen hook fish, bring them to the boat, and decide to throw them back overboard, either because they don't have any more quota, they've reached their bag limit, or they just don't want that particular species, right? And we make the assumption that a certain percentage of those fish that get thrown back live and a certain percentage die, right? And we have to calculate that so that we can accurately figure out how much discard mortality there is. And so what we can do with these participatory models is we can highlight that post-release mortality or discard mortality node that shows up in the model, and we can look at all of the in arrows to it. And so this really highlights all of the factors that fishermen perceive have an influence on discard mortality. And some of them are pretty obvious, right? Like water temperature. We know that when water is warmer, fish are less likely to survive stressful incidents like being hooked in the mouth. But there's a couple other things that really aren't being considered right now. So this node here says depredation or scavenging. So depredation is when a fisherman hooks a fish, is reeling it in, and all of a sudden a big shark comes over and takes a chunk out of it, right? So basically, non-target predators are catching these fish that have already been hooked. And this is a source of mortality that previously was not being considered in a stock assessment context. So we just weren't really thinking about that mortality. But according to these fishermen, depredation in the Gulf has become increasingly popular. It's happening a lot. Sharks are everywhere, according to the fishermen, and they're catching all of the fish. So this is a really important node here that we need to think about when we're calculating that discard mortality, and something that we might not have thought about otherwise if we hadn't had this information from the fishermen. And then I'll just skip to the last step of the process, which is communication. And here we can actually look at the unintended consequences of management. So a lot of times managers make these decisions on, how to set bag limits or seasons, et cetera, to try to increase fish abundance. But there can be ramifications. There can be consequences of those actions, right? So here we can kind of do the opposite. We can look at all of the regulation nodes in the model, and we can look at the out arrows to kind of examine what fishermen perceive are the consequences. So for example, if we're changing the recreational season length, A shorter season might benefit fish populations, but it can also increase discarding rates, right? If you're not in the red snapper season, you have to throw those fish back. And again, like we talked about, that might be increasing rates of depredation. So these are just sort of things that can help managers visualize and think more clearly through these management decisions. So with that, I'll just quickly summarize. We created these conceptual models based on conversations with fishery stakeholders, use that information to input ecosystem and socioeconomic information into each step of the assessment process. And now the next step here is more collaborative management, right? We want to continue to work with our stock assessment scientists and with managers to make sure this type of information is more routinely considered in the assessment process. So we're working together with all those teams to do so. And with that, I'll just note that this is published. You can go check out the paper if you'd like. And thank you to sort of everybody that was involved in this project. And time for a question, perhaps. Thank you.